silly, basically, just a guided tour of chicks from different regions, but set into this alarmingly cool, sort of sonic setting, which begins with this sort of orchestral opening, which seems to come from Aaron Copland's Book of Tricks, which establishes kind of like a country and western rhythm.
California Girls. Okay, I'm going to play the body of it. See them tumbling down. Ba, ba, da, 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 da. Oh, now you've heard that tune, right? See, so he probably got the idea of the bass line from that style of music. I played that when I had to do some tapes for the EMP Music Museum in Seattle. I started playing this line. It was on the tape, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, country music." I said, "No, it's not country music. That's Brian Wilson's bass line."
I remember going to Columbia Studios and hearing the start of the song, and I went, wow. And it was California Girls. The very opening part of that song before they come, that's actually, if you listen to it, that's Pet Sounds. That's the start of Pet Sounds, I think.
Well, East Coast girls are hip. I really dig those styles they wear. And the Southern girls with the way they talk, they knock me out when I'm down there.
You've got Carl playing the 12-string part, and you hear the band go, dum, dum, bum, and then a big chord, not beating you over the head. So it's like a theme. I mean, it could have been anything classical, like Beethoven's bum, 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 bum. You have bum, 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 bum. It's great. And then the rhythm starts, all this stuff, heralding the fact that you should pay attention to this cool song and a great chorus.
A creative idea that's translated onto tape via instruments, but the instruments specifically aren't the important part. You're not listening to somebody jamming. You're listening to people making sounds. And that's how Brian Wilson is starting to become a really unique, not just record producer, but a musical entity,
Though Summer Days and Summer Nights peaked at #2 on the Billboard chart, clustered around it were the icons of the burgeoning American counterculture. Along with the Beatles beginning their journey toward the left field, the Rolling Stones represented the rebel edge of the British invasion, and an electric Dylan the prophet of the bohemian youth. With the nation's young dispatched to war in Vietnam, civil rights clashes in Alabama, and a growing politicization of art and culture, airy Californian beach fantasies seemed far from relevant.
The famous Jimi Hendrix quote, "You'll never hear surf music again," that embodies a kind of dismissal of surf music, and in many ways a dismissal of the Beach Boys. That was in the air, as the 60s moved along. There was something about the early Beach Boys music that seemed adolescent in a way. This didn't take into account the complexity of what the music was, the complexity of the vocals, the vision that the songs represented. I mean, things were changing very rapidly, and nobody was accounting for all that. It's only later that people would go back and realize how great those early songs were.
I think naivete is a perfect word to describe the lyric content of most of or certainly early Beach Boys records. But it's also very, very true and heartfelt. And I think the reason that it was so successful is that people who listened to it recognized the truth of it.
The idea that the early Beach Boys songs were anti-intellectual is probably true. I mean, it was a vision of California that was sensual. That was the appeal of it.
Whether it was shallow, I mean, the thing is, at that time in pop culture and rock music, the Beatles were, becoming more sophisticated. They had found in their own way a more sophisticated worldview. And that is really, I think, in a lot of ways, the headwaters for the transformation of the vocabulary of rock and roll and pop culture, youth culture. Because, John Lennon could sing about paranoia in conscious terms, whereas your average Beach Boys song or your average pop song was more, IU, surfer girl type stuff. But on the other hand, I mean, just given who Brian is, and the complexity of his emotional state. Even these songs that people think of as very sunny, fun songs are far away from that, are much more complex than that. There are definite strains of anti-intellectualism within the group, but a lot of that was just based, I think, on the traditional sort of pop showbiz conservatism of, you know, you've got a formula, it works, don't mess with it.
Though messing with the formula was to become the guiding principle of Brian's approach in the latter part of the decade.
He's a real man, sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans.
Whether or not the mid-60s cultural milieu had presented the Beach Boys with something of a quandary, it had certainly liberated their chief songwriter from the record industry's infatuation with the hit single. The release of the Beatles' Rubber Soul in December 1965 had further expanded the frontiers of popular music, suggesting that the album could represent a complete work, beyond simply being a vehicle for singles. Naturally, the record and all of its implications made a huge impression on Brian Wilson.
The movement from singles to albums represented a major cultural shift. In terms of how artists would be treated, the fact that you would call them artists. I mean, nobody was calling Chuck Berry an artist. Nobody was calling Buddy Holly an artist. You know, but now, you know, there's this moment where because of the Beatles and Bob Dylan, you know, you have an environment in which it was possible to make an entire statement in an album, that an album was a coherent body of work that wasn't just hanging on a hit single. That was revolutionary at the time. So when Brian Wilson heard Rubber Soul, what he heard was a suite of songs. What he heard was a way in which you could be considered that way, to be thought of that way as an artist. And Brian Wilson wanted that. And so when he heard Rubber Soul, that's what he wanted to do, and an artist is what he wanted to be.
I think Brian, in his competitive world, thought he could probably maybe